Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Project Podcast presented by Project Insulin. Today we are joined by Allison Smart. Allison, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I would love to. It's great to be here with you, Eric. I am the mom of a 15-year-old daughter. She's got type 1 diabetes, diagnosed almost 3 years ago. And I've been on a journey this past year. The type of basal insulin she uses, Levemir insulin, was announced that it will be discontinued back in November. And so since then, I have been on a journey to get that decision slowed down. If we can get this insulin still produced for 3 years, we can have biosimilars available. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I'm excited to get into the discussion about Levemir and just access to different types of insulin because this is something that I didn't know until I met you. So I'm very excited to get into that. But before we go there, I'd love to talk about your experiences as a mom of someone with type 1 diabetes. Could you walk us through a little bit of your daughter's diagnosis process and what it was like for you as a parent? Did you already know about diabetes? Was this something that maybe you've seen it in family members or friends or something? Or did this come as a complete new experience for you?
It was a total new experience. We didn't think anyone in the family had it. I had studied it in school. I'm a physical therapist, so I had taken classes, chemistry, and studied the Krebs cycle. And we had studied about diabetes, but I didn't know people close to me. And just, it really came out of the blue. It was almost 3 years ago. It was actually Thanksgiving Day. We were at a restaurant with a family, and my daughter was 13, and she just kept getting a drink of water every time the waiter passed. It was almost ridiculous. And little alarm bells started going off because I remembered her saying the previous weeks at school she would finish her water bottle in the first class.
Mm-hmm.
And her friends were mentioning that she was leaving often to use the bathroom, and then we went to a movie and she left to go, same thing, a couple times to go use the bathroom, get a drink. And we walked out of the movie, and my then 18-year-old daughter walked up to me and said, "Mom, she's showing the signs of type 1." So it took my older daughter, who had a best friend with type 1 and had done a project on it in school, and that's what it took. So the next day we're in the ER, and it was very out of the blue.
That's wow. To hear that your older daughter was the one that kind of caught it is really interesting and goes to show that she was really taking note when her friend who has it, she really listened. So that's very good to hear from your older daughter's perspective. Interestingly, you are now the second person I've spoken with who has had a Thanksgiving specific diagnosis story. Not just a random, similarly, it was after the dinner, it flared up a bit more. And so what has it been like these past 3 years? We're in a time where there's so much technology and there's so much available to help new patients, people who've already had diabetes for a long time. But I'm curious about from the new perspective, because for those who've already had it, it's like, this like really alleviated some of the burden. But for a new patient, I can imagine that there's also like a bit more of that overwhelming sense where you have to understand how the technology works as well.
Yeah. So pretty soon, the first couple days and weeks, you're just in a haze and you're just trying to get by. But we knew pretty quickly we wanted a CGM, which is just a blood glucose monitor. And so we were able to get that within a few weeks. We worked out with our insurance, and that was great. Before that, we had been finger pricking every few hours. So that was really great. The other part, the types of insulin that we'll get into, is such a part of my journey because I researched within the first couple months. I just delved into reading and studying everything about what basal insulins are available and how are they different, which pumps are available, how are they different, how do they work with sports, how do they work with teenagers. And I just immersed myself in that. And I found out pretty quick that I wanted Levemir for my daughter's insulin. We weren't quite ready for a pump yet. We knew we were going to try one soon, but I researched that there's 3 basal insulins available. So basal are the long-acting insulins. You take insulin to run in the background and also insulin with food that's fast-acting. And there are only 3 types of insulins that run in the background. And Levemir is unique in that it's got this shorter time of action. We're using 12 to 14 hours. Some people can get away with 1 a day. Some people need even 3 shots a day. But typically with Levemir, it's 2 shots a day. And the others, the glargine insulins last about 20 hours. Same thing. People take them once or sometimes twice a day. And then there's Tresiba or Degludec, which lasts 42 hours. And I just studied those 3, and I knew already that the shorter time of action of Levemir would be perfect because it's easily to change with a girl going into a menstrual cycle, her hormones drive insulin needs. So that fluctuates throughout the month. So you hear things a lot, keep your insulin the same for several days till you make sure it's basal, you need to change. I could never do that. We consistently fluctuate throughout the month. We'll stay for a couple days and then we'll realize, oh, we don't have enough or we've got too much. And it's so ideal. It's ideal for athletes. So we got on that insulin and then we got things dialed in. About a year later, we tried an insulin pump. We tried it for 3 months. People love their pumps. I think they're a great tool. For us, we're in a group that my daughter plays a ton of tennis pretty much every day. She likes to play a lot of weekend tournaments and it worked. We get really great control and we got similar control during the week. But on those weekend tennis tournament days, in our case, that pump didn't keep up. Now, some people will say, no, I have a pump that's great for athletics. In our case, I just think with all the sweat and the heat and the activity all day long, somehow the cannula was maybe getting occluded and she just wasn't getting the insulin she needed. So several times during those 3 months, we ended up taking the pump off in the middle of a day of competition, which is not something you want to switch up day of, and going back to shots. So for us, it's just ideal. Now that it's been almost 3 years, we've just dialed things in with diet and activity and dosing, and we know when we need to change. And we feel like we're in a good place. We really understand it quite well.
Yeah, no, that's, if we've learned one thing on the podcast, is that everyone has very different reactions to the foods they eat, to the insulin they use, and what works for a lot of people might not work for you or your daughter or for anybody else. I think that has been one of the things that we've heard is frustrating, is you like going through and it's like trial and error, right? You have to, but the stakes with that trial and error is that you don't feel well. And so, right, it's a hard, frustrating thing to be trial and erroring with. And yeah, I guess I'm curious about, how has your relationship with your daughter changed these past 3 years? Because it sounds like you are both a very engaged mother, which is great. But I'm curious, has it led to you guys being closer? Has it led to some tension?
It's tricky. And I think in our case, she was 13. You're just beginning as a teenager, beginning those junior high years, which are rough anyway. And that's the time of life you want to do your own thing. You want to be separate and leave your mom and dad alone. And we were forced to stay a little more connected than probably most, but we figured it out. So I'm not going to say it's super smooth and easy and we don't have our moments, but it's part of the relationship. I like to think, diabetes becomes part of you and I respect it and I know it. I feel like we know each other. I almost think of diabetes as, there's a website in Canada called Waltzing with the Dragon or Dancing with the Dragon or something. And I think of that. I think we're dancing. Like we get it. We're always adjusting and working on things, but we figured it out.
Yeah, no, that's great. I want to do more questions related to being a parent of a child, because we've gotten a few, not interviews, but people who I know who are like, it'd be so great to hear how parents deal with the different ages, right? Like a 4-year-old with diabetes is a lot different than when they're 10 or 12 or 15 and becoming more independent. I'm asking these questions because I know that people want to hear this, have it so that they can be soothed for their future experiences with their kids as well. So I know I appreciate you talking a little bit about it and being honest that it's not always going to be perfect, but you move ahead with what you have. So I'm curious if you have any specific advice for a parent of someone with a teen who has diabetes.
My advice would be do it with them. I mean, I've tried the shots, I can't take the insulin with her, but if she's going to eat a specific way, I'm going to do that. And that was some advice I got early, which was something different than I've heard a lot. But there are foods that are easier on her blood sugar. And because she's an athlete, and as you mentioned, you feel better in a certain range. It's about long-term complications, but it's about now. And she knows that if I'm in this specific range, I play tennis better. I see the ball better. Wacky things happen if you go too high or too low, of course. She's missed very little time from her tennis because we're careful with the food and with our insulin. And again, everyone has their own type of management. But I do what she does. If she's a little high and she knows she'll be better off waiting to eat for a while so she can play tennis, I'm going to wait too, so I know how it feels. And I'm not saying if she's out somewhere else, if she's home and we're together, I'm not going to go sit and have something in front of her when she's, I'd feel a little better if I'd wait 30 minutes. So I guess that's the advice that I got that really changed my life. I asked some advice of people that I really respected. And I said, look, How do I do this? How do I make her life, how do I help her life be the best it can be? And
Hmm.
my advice, and the advice that came back to me, was do it too. Do it with her.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting advice. We haven't heard that yet, so
Yeah.
thank you. And so we met separate of your daughter's experiences. We met as a result of your advocacy.
Mhm.
And before we get into the work of today, can you walk me, like, how did you get there? What was the turning point that led you to become an advocate and to champion, without spoiling too much, insulin variety, specifically with Levemir?
Yeah. So again, as I studied in those early months, I knew already that we have the option of 3 basal insulins. And then in November of 2023, November 8th, there was an announcement by Novo Nordisk that they will discontinue Levemir insulin by December of 2024. And I was floored because I already knew this was the ideal one for our situation. And I knew others in a similar situation. And I just thought someone's going to fix this. And so I started calling the World Health Organization, the FDA, the pharmaceutical companies, and physicians and everyone. And they all said, you know what, there's nothing I can do. Our government representatives are the only ones that can fix this. I created a petition that over 4,000 people have signed. And then they all pretty much said the same thing. They said, there's nothing we can do, but senators and congressional representatives can help. So I said, okay. So several of us, we created an organization called the Alliance to Protect Insulin Choice. And first trip to DC was in February. That trip, we had appointments with the offices of over 15 senators and congressional representatives. Went back in May and July. And I'm going to go. So right now we're in September, and I know this won't be aired for a little while, but I'm planning on leaving again next week to go back to DC. And I'm just communicating with offices. We're asking that Novo Nordisk cooperate and extend the discontinuation for 3 years. I've also been in communication with several insulin manufacturers, and they're saying, look, there's a market for this. We'd like to bring a biosimilar, which is a generic, to the market. But the only way we can do it is if we get 3 more years. So the original estimate from some companies was we need 3 to 8 years to bring a new insulin to the market. But several of them said we could do it. We could make it happen if they gave us 3 years. You can't bring an insulin to the market if there isn't an existing patient base, if there aren't people using it, because it's an expensive investment of time and money to bring an insulin to the market. And if there isn't a ready group ready to use it, and if this continuation does go through as planned, all these people that have been using Levemir, like us, will be just compelled to go onto a pump or one of the other 2 basal insulins, which once you get on a regimen, it's difficult to make sure your insurance is covering it. It's an expense. It's a whole new way of learning. You can't just switch on a dime. So we're saying we really need help. We need pressure on Novo Nordisk, and we need Novo Nordisk to understand, look, you've done awesome for us. We're not trying to criticize anyone out there. We're just saying we depend on this. We need you to hand off the baton. You need to give us time to make this work.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, the lack of choice is something that I hadn't heard about until you shared it with me. And so I'm curious, could you share, like, how many people use Levemir in the United States, just as like a reference point?
The last statistics we could find online was 2021, and over 1 million were using Levemir in the US. There were 6.3 million people using long-acting insulin. Over 1 million of that were using Levemir. Under about 800,000 were using Tresiba, which is Degludec, the other one produced by Novo Nordisk. Over 4 million were using Glargine, which is the most common long-acting insulin. There are several, comes by several different names. There are several biosimilars available. And then there were about 500,000 using NPH. We haven't even used NPH in our argument because it's technically an intermediate insulin, but that's the statistics from 3 years ago. And then we did just barely get statistics for 2 years ago, and there were still over 900,000 using Levemir, just under 900,000 using Tresiba. And that's 3 years ago is when this was starting to be squeezed out of the market and been possibly removed from some formularies. It's a complicated issue, but there's your numbers for the US.
Yeah, thank you. I had a feeling you would just know them off the top of your head at this point. But yeah, I want to talk about what this means from a patient perspective, like talking about the patient journey. You mentioned that switching is hard, not just for the individual, but also like routine wise, but also from an insurance standpoint. Insurance companies will not let you switch insulins unless you absolutely have to, or prove that insulin B works better than insulin A. And we've heard many stories about this over time of people like not being able to, if anyone remembers Lisa was in season one
Mhm.
of the podcast, and Lisa introduced Allison to me. But Lisa moved on to Tresiba, but it took her months of fighting and months of proving to the insurance company that like her CGM showed that she was in range longer and that it was working better and easier for her to manage her diabetes with Tresiba, even though the insurance company wanted her to use, I don't remember what it was, but something else. And that is just one example of the millions of people who are on different types of insulin. And if you're on Levemir, you're going to have to go through that now. Let's say they tell you to go on Tresiba, for example, and you actually end up being a better fit with glargine of the two
Mhm.
that are left. That's going to be a whole nother process. And it's going to be months and months of frustration, the months of additional medical costs. It's very frustrating to hear that. Could you tell us a little bit about Levemir's history, how it came to market? It's not an insulin that I knew of before meeting you, which was interesting as someone who's trying to bring an insulin to market to have not heard of Levemir before. Could you share a little bit about that history?
Sure. So the glargine Lantus came to the market in the year 2000. And then in 2005 is when Levemir came to the market. Tresiba came in 2015. And then Novo Nordisk has been the only company producing both Levemir and Tresiba. There are no generics. Sometimes you'll interchange the names. So Levemir is also Detemir, which is the generic name, and Tresiba is Degludec. So people get confused. They say, are there two? Actually, Novo has come out with Degludec, but it's still Novo Nordisk that makes Tresiba, and it's still patent protected and will be for several years. Levemir, so they announced last March that the price of Levemir would be reduced by 65% effective January of 2024. So they said, we're going to reduce the price. But then in November, they said, actually, we're just not going to make it. But a little bit more about that. So the FDA exclusivity of Levemir by Novo Nordisk did run out in 2021, but they filed additional patents with the US Patent Office that effectively extended their exclusivity. So no other company has had the ability to make a Levemir biosimilar until March of this year. Novo said privately to several Senate offices and to myself that they won't assert a patent against a biosimilar manufacturer. So now we're saying we can make it, but it is such an ordeal to bring an insulin to the market. It's getting a huge, slow moving train started. It takes time. I don't know if that answers some of your questions about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely go into detail on how long it takes to bring a drug to market. And yes, I'll share a little bit just because
Yeah,
I
I
mean
like that.
people have heard of it, but maybe not
That's
today
important.
specifically. But yeah, you have to create your own strain of the insulin, and then you have to go through the testing. You have to make sure that it's stable. You have to make sure that it's not toxic. Then you have to make sure that it works properly. Then you have to go and present all this to the FDA, and this can take 5 to 8 years, depending on the organization, depending on how much of a head start they have. For example, there are many manufacturers who have used different insulins for other projects, and so they have a foundation. And so for them, it takes 3 years, like you had mentioned. But for us, for example, at Project Insulin, we're doing a biosimilar generic glargine, but we didn't come in with a base. So we have to create that base and then go through that. And that'll take us 5 to 8 years. And people ask why it takes so long. It's because you have to make sure that it works correctly. This is something that's going into people's bodies. Yes, it is expensive and it's going to take us a while, but I'm very happy to know that by the time we get an insulin into someone's body, it has been tested a million times and that there's no way anything goes wrong, because that would be really scary, and patient trust is really important. But anyway, so
Yeah.
that is a bit on the drug development into the manufacturing side as well.
I
Yeah.
think that's important. I'm glad you put that out there. I think there's this idea, there's a reason that only 3 companies have produced the vast majority of insulin for quite some time. And it's a problem. We're seeing shortages of many types of insulin right now. And we're really worried. There's so much focus on GLP-1s and so many people we can help with type 2. Who's taking care of us? Who's watching out for us? It's really quite frightening to just eliminate a whole type of insulin that a million people have used in the US when there are shortages of other kinds all around that are being reported. You didn't hear about insulin shortages several years ago. It's really quite frightening. We feel quite vulnerable that we're not really being watched out for.
Yeah, absolutely. Eli Lilly announced supply chain shortages for 2024. and for insulin specifically. And the big three manufacturers, Sanofi, Lilly, and Novo Nordisk, are all moving towards GLP-1 drugs and taking that manufacturing space and replacing the insulin that they were making with that. So yeah, of course, there will be less insulin available, whether it be because they're cutting products out or literally not making as much. So this was not problems we had foreseen when we started, but we are happy that we are on the way to alleviating some of those shortages.
And
Uh,
we need you.
next
We
few
need
years.
this what you're doing is so valuable. We need you to bring insulin to the market. We need other manufacturers too. This is the solution, really.
Yeah, yeah. And when it comes to, we're totally going on a tangent here, but you mentioned that the three manufacturers and how expensive it is, and of course that is part of why there's only three. One of our big issues, and the reason that I started Project Insulin, was that all makes sense and holds up with innovation. That does not make sense, nor does it hold up when it comes to generics. We should not be living in a country where generic drugs are being made by organizations that fully focus on profit maximization. And it's not like their fault, right? They are for-profit companies, fiduciary duty to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. But the whole point of generic drugs is that it's available for the people at affordable rates. And that has not happened with insulin. And that's why we tackled Project Insulin and are starting with a glargine. And you reached out to us to see if we could potentially do a generic Levemir. And in 5 to 10 years, when we have the first one done, the answer is yes. And that's the beauty, is that one day we can be leaned on to create all sorts of different insulins because we'll have the infrastructure ready. But at this point, that was not something we could add because we don't have the bandwidth for it.
The fact though that you are in this space and you're willing to work on this, and that's just, it's huge. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for humanity. This is
Mhm.
not a population that's going to go away. We need this, and we're so grateful.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And
Mm.
I'm grateful for the work that you're doing as well with advocacy. I think this is a good opportunity to share just how important it is to have different insulin types, as well as just educate people on what's going on in the world of diabetes, type 1, type 2, specifically the world of insulin. And so, one question I have for you is how, when you started the group about insulin choice, how did you get in front of the different lawmakers, the senators, the state reps? What was that process like?
I still feel like I'm learning. I've never done anything in advocacy before or with government groups, or I never started a petition. I wasn't even big on social media, but I just talked to people and they said, hey, you can do a petition. The petition is on change.org and you can find it. It should be easy. We can put a link on this
Mhm.
on our show notes, but people not only signed it, but there are hundreds of comments that are so tender. This, like, my child can only use Levemir, or I'm an adult and I've tried all three and I had these things happen. I used a pump for 20 years. Now I get skin infections and I can't. And I've tried the other two and they just don't work. But as far as getting appointments, I just started talking to people and reached out on some social media. My social media presence, ours is small, but enough people are out there that they said, we're working on the same thing and what do we do? So I started reaching out to these offices. Luckily, I started reaching out in advance. You got to start working on it early. It takes a long time and setting things up. And I've just learned as I've gone. I've had great people who will talk to me. It's interesting lately, as this is becoming more talked about, there are people who agree to talk to me and then they cancel right before. And they say, we just talked to Novo and they said you're already in contact with, you have deep relationships with Novo. And I say, if those deep relationships are the fact that I have reached out to Novo and said, we need this continued, and you've responded no, to me, that doesn't really qualify as a deep relationship. But certainly I've reached out to them. I spend all my time that I can on reaching out and emailing and calling. And it's just evolved to this point where I have not gotten help. This is all on my own expense and my family's expense, but we just feel that this is crucial for our daughter's future. This needs to happen. Something needs to change here that we can make this happen, because it's so important. So that's how it's evolved.
Yeah, and I will say again, for the Alliance to Protect Insulin Choice, the Facebook group is active. Like, you have a good group of people. People are always commenting and discussing and sharing their stories, which is hard to see, right? It's hard to see that so many people are being affected by this or will be affected by this
Mhm.
come 2025.
Well, they are starting. So many have been going off of it already, which I wish they wouldn't. I wish they would stay on so that we could, but even their physicians are saying, oh, let's start to work on something else. And they are seeing problems. I talked to a physician at Yale who said several months ago, she said, we have a large group of adolescents who are experiencing weight gain from the other two insulins. And if you Google it, Levemir is shown to produce the least amount of weight gain of the three basal insulins. Other problems like that. I have physicians who specialize in diabetes and pregnancy who are saying, I have some who say, I only want to use Levemir in pregnancy. It's the only one shown in randomized controlled trials to be safe for pregnancy. There are cohort studies or case studies, but the American Diabetes Association states that randomized controlled trials are preferred. And the reason why this one's so important in pregnancy is you can match different insulin needs in the day versus the night, which in pregnancy is quite often a lot of women with gestational diabetes who didn't need insulin before and won't need it after their pregnancy only need insulin at night. So you need an insulin that you can take in the evening. It's just active through night and it wears off in the day. And I have physicians who are saying, I literally don't know what I will do if Levemir is not available, because that randomized controlled trials have not been done on glargine in pregnancy. There was one on Tresiba in pregnancy last year, but there were concerns. It didn't show some of the outcomes that we needed to see. And if you've got a longer lasting insulin, when a woman has a baby, whether she has type 1 or just gestational diabetes, her insulin needs just drop at delivery. It's a real sudden drop. And so if you've got a longer lasting insulin that's going to last, that's going to make that postpartum period more difficult.
And I was curious if you were going to bring up pregnancy, because I remember seeing the stats on that, and it was like, oh, wow, this is not something that I'd ever seen before or had known about. And yeah, it was just another interesting like kernel of just why this is so important and why having choice is so important.
Well, can I say one more thing on that point? Some insulin is better than no insulin. So I don't want to say if someone needs insulin, you need insulin, right? So if you need insulin for a pregnancy, I'm just saying if we've got a tool that makes it easier to manage, why would we let that leave? If it does leave, we'll have to be fine with the other methods, but I just don't know why we would let that happen.
And I'm curious what has been, you shared that some of the responses from some of the organizations has been, you already have a relationship with them, there's nothing more we could do. But what has it been like with the government officials? How have they responded? What is like in the works? Give us a little peek behind that curtain.
So there's a mix. Right now we're focusing, it'll be interesting because when this recording comes out, we'll be looking back. This
Yeah.
will have happened, but in 2 weeks on September 24th, today is September 9th, there's going to be a hearing, a help committee hearing. Bernie Sanders is bringing in Lars Jorgensen, the CEO of Novo Nordisk, to Washington, D.C. to talk about the high price of Ozempic and Wegovy. I will be at that hearing. There will be others with me. We've communicated with each of the Senate offices. When you communicate with senators, you're often communicating with the aides and they're relaying information. And we're asking that they mention every senator on the 21 senators on the help committee has time to address. They can either ask questions or comment about Levemir. And even though Levemir isn't the topic of the hearing, it's definitely related, because here's the CEO of the only company that can make the decision about this, that can help us pass the baton on to other companies. And so we're saying, if you will stand up for us, no one's watching out for us. This is a real frightening place to be in as the type 1 diabetic community. I've talked to I've talked to the leading advocacy organizations. They're not addressing this. So I've also reached out to physician organizations like the Endocrine Society and like state medical associations. My state medical association told me we don't get involved in granular issues involving one pharmaceutical drug. So I come away and I think, who then? No advocacy organization, no physician organization. So I really think it comes down to our senators. If you will stand up for us and realize we need the tools we need to live active, happy lives, then we can make this happen. If you don't, I don't know. And I'm getting mixed reviews. They have so much on their plate. You don't just reach out to a Senate office and have them get all your attention. And I think this is the other thing that will be interesting when this recording comes out. I think in some cases it will be a game time decision. I will show up on Tuesday, September 24th, hoping that several senators will bring this up during the hearing, and they may or they may not. I don't know at this point how it's going to go.
Yeah. Wow. I wish you the best of luck on the 24th, and there will be a post the episode. I will come back on and share an update from you. You'll send an update to me, and I will share it with everybody. Let them know what happened. So
I'd love that.
Future me will come back a little bit later in the episode.
That would be great. I appreciate this a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this is an important topic to discuss. And Allison, I guess before we wrap up today, I wanted to know if there's anything else you want to talk about or anything else you wanted to bring up.
I think I addressed most of it. I guess I can take a minute to just plug. We've got our website, Alliance to Protect Insulin Choice, if you want to be more educated about the different types of insulin. And I'd like to educate. You mentioned early in the podcast that it's so difficult for some people to go through their insurance to change types. It shouldn't be that way. When you need insulin, you should be able to switch around and try. Be like, maybe this longer acting insulin will work better for this situation. And maybe I want to use a pump for this situation. And I just think if you're looking at, my daughter's 15, she's looking at 80 plus years of needing insulin. She should be able to choose the different types, and we should focus a little bit more on choice and availability. I'd like to thank one of our sponsors is Low Carbon Fasting. We could use more sponsors, more partners. They helped us with the video and with the website. We've got a YouTube video of over 20 people saying exactly why this is important. That's on our website. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to bring up. If any of you would like to help, we can't do this by ourselves. We are an organization. We're in touch with others around the country and around the world, but we're small and we need more, and every voice matters. Some of these Senate offices, some states are like, I want to hear from people in my state, and they're not hearing. And we could really use people reaching out. One thing, pregnant women are not reaching out at all, I think, because I'm assuming not much, because they've used this insulin in the past. They were given a prescription for insulin. They didn't think, which kind was I given? They don't get into that. They're busy. They're going to have a baby. And then they have the baby and they don't need it anymore. So all these people that have benefited from Levemir and don't have it anymore, they don't even realize how important it is and that they will want it. Some of these women will have future pregnancies and think, why is it a little more difficult this time than it was before? And they won't understand why. So I would love people to get more educated. We're trying to help with that on our website, and we'd like to be in contact with more, and we need the help. And Eric, I just thank you for doing this podcast. It helps. And the fact that you are in this space and working on bringing insulin to the market is huge. We need this. We need all the types. We need the 3 long-acting insulins widely available. We need the fast-acting insulins and multiple kinds of pumps. And that would be a world where our children and those around us would have an easier life if they have options.
Yeah. Allison, thank you. Again, best of luck in a couple of weeks. I hope it goes well. I'll be tuning in.
Really appreciate this.
And thank you everyone for joining on another episode of Project Podcast presented by Project Insulin. If you like the episode, like it, subscribe, share, post it on your social media accounts, comment in the comments below if you want to get involved with protecting insulin choice. And we'll talk to you at the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Eric.
Hi, everyone. Just making a follow-up to this podcast episode with Allison Smart. Thank you all for listening in this far. Quick update on what happened at the HELP hearing on September 24th. Allison was pleased that the Levemir discontinuation was addressed by Senators Hassan, Collins, and Baldwin. And a couple of quotes that she wanted to share included Senator Hassan asked a question to Lars Jorgensen, the CEO of Novo Nordisk, saying, Mr. Jorgensen, this year Novo Nordisk abruptly discontinued the drug Levemir. Levemir is a critical insulin product and one of the few long-acting insulins approved for use during pregnancy. By discontinuing Levemir, Novo Nordisk interrupted the diabetes care plans of millions of Americans. Will Novo Nordisk agree to provide any interested company with the necessary information and drug formulation to make Levemir? Lars Jorgensen responded with a quote saying, if there is a company interested in the manufacturing of Levemir or the government wants to manufacture it, we'll be happy to collaborate. This issue is still unresolved and we are We will keep you updated as we learn more and stay in touch with Allison, as well as senators and government representatives across the United States. So thank you all for listening and for being a part of our community. I look forward to hopefully having an update to you in the spring. Thanks.